Hi, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for another PB&J card class, and I'm continuing with the winter themed cards, and here's a look at the card that we will be creating today. The stamped panel is all nearly one layer and features one of our new cling stamps from our first snow collection. It is called Winter Tales, and I think it is just the sweetest little stamp, especially if you love birds. Now, before I begin, I wanted to mention I will have a full supply list up at the very end of the video up on screen, so if you want to check it out in more detail at that time, just hit pause and you can check it out. I'm going to start my stamping using my Misty Stamp Positioning Tool, and I'm stamping onto Canson 140-pound watercolor paper, and I am stamping this with archival ink. This is the color of Acorn, and I'm going to stamp it just a couple of times to darken up that ink and get a good impression onto the texture of that watercolor paper. Now I went ahead and stamped that again onto Eclipse masking paper, and I just fussy cut the mask around the image. It's very easy to cut actually. And so you can do so many things with this if you like to do masking and create one layer cards, because you can add trees or whatever you want behind this fence. You can create whatever type of landscape you would like back there. So you can just lay this mask down onto your paper and then begin the stamping of your background. And you can save the masks, as you can see I've done here, for repeated use over and over. So for my background in the stamping behind, I'm going to use our new cling stamp called Before the Snow. This is a beautiful tree that you can use like all in whites, but I'm going to be doing it in some greens here. And I'm going to do it on both sides of the birds, but vary the height a little bit of this tree. So I'm going to just keep the mask in place and ink this with archival ink. I'm using a fern green archival ink, starting light and stamping it a couple of times. Again, this watercolor paper is going to have some texture, but I wanted to use a nice thick watercolor paper because I am going to be doing quite a bit of painting onto this entire scene. Now I'm looking here just to get the detail of this stamp, but I will be going back in and painting right on top to add more shading and to tie it into the rest of the image. Also to cover any gaps where it doesn't quite get right up to the mask. So you don't need to worry too much about that if it's not perfectly right up to the edge of where you had your masking. Now I cleaned off the stamp just so it's clean when I reposition it on the other side. And you can see it's kind of going off of the edge, but a little bit higher than it was on the right hand side. And this just gives a little bit extra interest to the background design. And I'm going to follow the same process here, just stamping this over the mask and into the background a few times to get all of that detail. Now comes the fun part, when you get to remove the mask and start to see the scene coming to life. And then I'm going to begin just painting this. So I am painting this using Distress reinkers used as watercolors. I just squeeze a little dot onto my palette off to the side and then paint them on. Again, all of the exact colors I'm using will be listed up on screen at the very end of the video. I love using these for my watercolor paints because the color is very rich and bold. When it dries, it doesn't dry too much lighter, so you get a pretty good idea when you're putting it on what colors you're going to have, and it just behaves differently than watercolors typically do. So I recommend, if sometimes you don't enjoy watercolor or you like bold colors, grab your reinkers and just give them a try. Use them as some paints. Now that palette that you see off to the right, these will stay wet like forever. So even if you get a big dot or you don't use everything you put on your palette, you don't need to clean it off. You could even get a palette with a lid so it's easier to store, but I just put this up at the top of where I store my paints and pull it out whenever I'm going to paint with my Distress reinkers, and you can just keep using them. So none of it goes to waste over there on that palette. It doesn't dry out over there. So I'm just painting right on top of these different areas, coloring them in. Nothing too complicated as far as shading. I think most of the detail is really there in the stamp for you. It's going to look beautiful whether you spend a lot of time on shading or you don't. For example, on these birds, I'm not doing anything too fancy with them, just a couple of colors. And I really want the focal point of this image to be these two birds, sort of their gaze at each other. And so you'll see by placing the trees on each side, when I do the sky and some inking up on the sky in a little bit, everything is going to kind of point towards these birds right in the center of the card. Now, if you wanted to give this a totally different look, you could even stamp this onto a smaller size card. I'm using closer to a 5x7 size here, but you could use just a portion of this image, and you could even have the birds stamped like off to the left or off to the right and have more room then for your scene in the background or a sentiment next to them, or off balance, not quite as in the center. But I love that gaze of those birds right up at each other. This is great for a Christmas card. I think it also would be really nice if you have anyone that has an anniversary near the holidays or in the winter, or to give to a special someone, just because there's something kind of winter romantic about those two little birds, I think. Just the happiness of the season and Christmas time, the joy and the love that we share when we're with each other. So anyways, I won't bore you too much more with my talking here. I'm going to turn on a little bit of Christmas music while I finish painting things up, and I will be back in just a bit. once everything was painted, I decided to go up here and add some inking up into the sky. I'm using the Cobalt Archival ink with a Sukaneko Jumbo Sponge Dauber tool, and I'm adding that ink into the upper right and left hand corners. And again, the whole idea is just darkening that up and leaving sort of a wide open area that leads the eye right to those birds and where the sentiment will soon be stamped as well. And I chose this particular ink just because I love the color. I think it's so great and dark and rich and wonderful for a snowy sky. Now the sentiment is from our new transparent set called Frosty Hello. Also another one of these great sentiment sets that you can use for holiday and Christmas cards or also throughout the winter months. I went ahead and stamped that sentiment, and before I add my snow flurries flying here, I did cover it up with a post-it note and covered the birds and the head of the bird on the fence just to be sure I don't get like a big splatter of snow right on a word or right on top of the bird's face or something. And I'm using Arteza gouache white paint to do the splatters. I love using this for snow. Just water it down and splatter it on. It's also great to use unwatered down, so this panel is dry, and you can paint it on to create some snowy areas, and it's got a little bit of texture if you don't water it down because it's a thicker paint. So gouache paint is sort of like an opaque watercolor, and the more water you add to it, the thinner and looser it will be. And if you use it like this, it's kind of like almost like an acrylic, and it's kind of got a little bit of a chunky texture. It's so great for adding snowy details. You can also use it to paint just a few snowflakes up into the sky. These ones will be a little bit larger and a little bit brighter just because there's no water added to dilute that down, and that gives even more depth to the image. And by painting them on, you have some placement control as opposed to just when you are splattering things on. This way I could have them kind of going around the edges, and again, everything sort of surrounding and pointing to that image of those birds on the fence. You can add a couple of layers here for that snow that's built up on the fence. And also this makes it easier when you paint the fence, when you know going in later, you can just go back in right on top of whatever you've painted and add that snow in case you paint a little bit too high or your paint gets a little too dark on the fence area. So I'm just finishing up adding a few little snowflakes flying around in the sky. And then I mounted this to my note card using dimensional foam tape. And here's a closer look at some of that snow, those trees in the background, and one of the little birds. And then a look at the finished card design with that sentiment stamped on there as well. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as our website and blog, and I will link all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And stay tuned here in just a moment. I will pop up that list of all the supplies used on creating this card. Thanks for watching.